You like big books? So a couple weeks ago I did a video on some of the longest fantasy books on my TBR, and I thought I should do one of the longest fantasy books I've read. And I thought this was an apt t-shirt given the topic. So wasting no time, first off we have the Stormlight Archive. Now this is a list of individual book length, not series length, but you could pick any of the Stormlight Archive books and they would be in the top 10 longest fantasy books I've read, because they're all huge. In fact, as soon as you've read a Stormlight Archive book, suddenly what you consider long changes. But I don't talk about the Stormlight Archive often on here because I know it's super popular and most people already know about it. However, that doesn't detract from the fact that this is probably my favourite series of all time. I love these books so much. They mean so much to me. Each book does get slightly longer as well. The Way of Kings is about 1,000 pages long, and Rhythm of War, which is book 4, is 1,200 pages long. But each book does get slightly longer, and it looks like the book 5 will probably be even longer than that. But the real question is, does the story warrant the page count? And I think in terms of Stormlight, the answer is yes. There is an argument to be made that this story could be shorter. And I would agree with that. It definitely could be shorter. Particularly Oathbringer was the one that I most thought could have been a little shorter. But Stormlight's one of those rare occasions where I just want to spend more time in the world. So I'm really not mad about a slower section of the story, particularly when you're reading a 1,000 page long book. You expect slower sections, the author to really take his time, which Sanderson does, but I never felt bored with any of the Stormlight books. Very much journey before destination. One thing that Stormlight does that I really like is that it does have a huge cast of characters. But with each installment we have a different focus. So this first book is very much Kaladin's book. You see flashbacks of Kaladin's life before the events of the Way of Kings. In book 2 we get Shallan and her backstory, or at least part of it. And then book 3 is Dalinar, and book 5 is kind of 2 characters, but I'm not going to say because it's kind of a spoiler. But I really like that despite the fact that there is a huge cast of characters, you don't feel like you're juggling to understand all the different plot lines and character development. It is very much a focused story. The majority of the Stormlight Archive is 3 point of views. However, we do get other points of views as well from side characters, and we also get interludes, which some people really like and some people really don't like. The majority of the interludes are from characters that we only ever see the once, and they're usually spread out somewhere across the world. The things that turn up in the interludes then eventually play in or hint at something that's happening during the main plotline of the Stormlight Archive. It might not even be that book, but it does just add to this sense of scale because you have the main cast of characters and point of view, but these interludes just give you more perspectives in another place of the world, and it does just add to this scale and epicness of Stormlight Archive. But yes, the Stormlight Archive, some of the longest books I've ever read. I mean, jeez. Next up we have It by Stephen King. I read this last year and my edition has 1,070 odd pages, but my friend who I was buddy reading it with also has an edition that is 1,200 pages, so it really depends what edition you get, but either way it's a chunky book. I really enjoyed it. It's great. This is also a case where it is a very long book, but I think it warrants that length. Because it is a very slow story with lots of individual events that happen over a long period of time. We have this group of kids and we have them in the past dealing with some of the horrors that they come across, and also in the future dealing with some of the horrors that they come across. So this dual narrative of past and present across this wide range of 4 or 5 characters, all having their own individual experiences with the creature, It. This could have been a little bit shorter though. There are some scenes where we don't really need all this added information. One in particular, we had an antagonist character and we got this huge backstory of why he is the way he is, and then he pretty much just killed off in the next couple pages, and we didn't really need to know any of that at all because it didn't really matter for his motivations. It didn't really play into the plot at all. Also, if you've read this, there's a scene at the end that's so unnecessary and horrid, and I don't... I was enjoying the book so much until I read that. I was like, why are we doing this? Can you just have them remember the way, and then why did they have to... I'm not going into it. It's not nice though. One thing about these massive chunky books is it's a lot of build up and you want the finale to actually pay off for such a long book. I think there is an added pressure for really long books to have a really strong finale because you've had such a long story and build up. And I think it really did that. The final battle, if you will, is absolutely terrific. It's such a cool, bizarre fight. The thing that really surprised me with this is the world building. I didn't think that a King book would have this deep backstory, and that's completely my naivety towards King's work. I've read very few of his books, so I don't know if they're all like this, but the world building and backstory behind the creature It that we kind of learn throughout the story, especially towards the end, is really interesting. And I know his books are connected, so I'm wondering how much of that connects to his other work. I don't think it's particularly scary. It is creepy and there's lots of horrible scenes, but if you're not a big horror fan, I would still recommend checking out it. It's iconic. Next up, we have The Wise Man's Fear. Now this is about 1,000 pages long. This is the sequel to The Name of the Wind. I'm going to preface this with I love the Kingkiller Chronicles. They are fantastic. Probably some of my favourite books of all time. They're really, really good. However, because we're talking about length, I do want to mention something that bothered me with The Wise Man's Fear. And that's this idea of a nesting narrative. This is when you have a main goal, and within that goal, if you can't do that until you do this other thing. So then we go on like a wee mini quest. But then to maybe do that thing, we need to go fetch something. So then you're nesting again. It's kind of like a nesting doll, those old-fashioned nesting dolls. Or coding, if you're a coder, you have nesting expressions. And the latter half of this book, it felt like we were getting further and further away from the main plotline. Kvoth ran into some issues, so he had to go do this side thing to make money, I think it was. So then he was away and he was doing this side thing, and then the side thing ended up him having to go on a wee mini quest to do this other thing. And it just felt like we're getting further and further away from the main plotline. It does all tie back, and I'm sure in book 3 even the nesting narratives will eventually tie back into the main plotline. I definitely don't think it was a complete side tangent, but first time I was reading it, so I don't know if I'll feel like this on a reread, it did feel like we're moving further and further away from the main plotline. Kind of bothered me a little bit. I know Rothfuss is a really purposeful writer. He's got so many hints and foreshadowing and depth to his story, even just in the way he writes it. So I'm putting my trust in him that there is a reason that we did this in book 2, and in book 3 perhaps when it arrives one day, there will be a reason that we did this side tangent. So I'm not writing it off saying it was bad. I still really enjoyed reading it and it was a great time, but it is a bit of a gripe I have with this book. That being said, I love the Kingkiller Chronicles. I think they're fantastic. The prose is stunning. The purposeful writing and just the way he gives this mystery and depth that's just really interesting to try and piece together. And I really enjoy watching, especially Captured in Words. He does a fantastic job of making Kingkiller Chronicle theory videos and discussion videos, and they're really interesting to watch. It does make me realize how much of this goes over my head. I also think it's really masterfully done, because if you're not into theorizing and really delving deep in the world building, it's still such an entertaining story. You don't need to go the extra level and dive really deep into the foreshadowing and some of the hints of what's to come. You can just read this through and enjoy a really great story. I really like that, and I think Sanderson does it really well as well. He talks about he wants his books to be their own thing, and if you don't know what Cosmere is, that's fine. You can still read it and have a good time. And I very much feel like that's the same with Rothfuss's book, but not quite on the same style. This is very much in there in the story, but you don't need to sit and theorize and get the crazy person with a pinboard and connecting all the sentences together. It's still just really entertaining and a really immersive and great fantasy story. Next up, we have the Darkwater Legacy books, starting with The Ember Blade and then the sequel, The Shadow Casket. These are both over 800 pages long, so I'm just going to include them both on this list. I have mentioned this series a lot recently because I just read The Shadow Casket last month, the month before. What month is it? And I still think about it. It's such a good series, and it's one of those series where I've recommended a lot of books, and some books don't work for some people, which is fair enough. We all have our own tastes, but The Ember Blade is the one that most people that have checked it out have all come back and said it's a new favourite. This is a modernised, classic fantasy series with a large cast of really interesting characters. They each have their own stuff going on. It has some of my favourite side characters in any book. I love Vika. Vika's kind of the Gandalf mentor character. She's not your classic mentor. She's very much trying to figure it all out herself. She's a really interesting character to read about. There's also Grub, who is absolutely hilarious, but he also has so many heartfelt moments, especially in book 2. And Aaron and Cade, the main characters, are also terrific. If you like Lord of the Rings, please check out this series. It's fantastic. And even if you don't like Lord of the Rings, this is modernized, so things you don't like about Lord of the Rings is some of the over descriptiveness, then this is a little bit more streamlined. I did hear that some people don't like the more adject heavy prose style. Personally, I love the prose in this series. It just perfectly skirts the line between lyrical and really easy and quick to read. It's not overly metaphorical, but it still has that lyricism to it that I just love so much. I do think that this is a really well-paced series, seeing as we're talking about long books. These are both 800 pages long, and I think they're both really well-paced. Completely warrants the 800 plus pages each. I can't think of a section that you could cut out. It all is necessary and important and entertaining, and I love this series so much. There is one part in book 2 where we go back on a plot line, and it kind of is a bit repetitive. It's just a small section of the story, but I can see that being picked up on, especially because we're talking about length and, you know, if it warrants the page count. However, this is really minor, and I think that everybody should read this series. Next up, we have a self-published fantasy book, Illborn. Illborn is about 700 pages long, and it is a chunky boy. One thing that Illborn does really well is it pulls you through the story. It's a long book, and it does have slow moments, but the way it's written just pulls you through the story. It's got 4 points of view. Most of the time it's sequential. You go 1 to 4 and then back to the first point of view, and that's just how it runs throughout the whole book. But a lot of the chapters end on cliffhangers, or even just like an intriguing last line. You're like, I need to know what happens next. The problem is you're 3 chapters away from what happens next. So you just end up keep on reading. You read the 3 chapters, then you read that, and then it's like, wait, the last chapter for that character also ended in a bit of a cliffhanger. I need to keep reading. So despite the fact that it's a long book and it does have slower moments, it's something that will pull you through and you'll end up reading it probably pretty quickly. The thing that connects the 4 main characters is that they're all having the same dream. And it's this strange dream of walking up a mountainside, and then the 4 of them meeting at the top, and then there's this godlike being standing at the top, coaxing them onwards. So there is this kind of mystery to be unraveled. It reminds me a bit of Octopath Traveler, the video game on Switch, and now elsewhere I think. So if you played that, this kind of idea that there's different characters of different parts of the world, each going on their own story, but you assume they're all going to kind of come together at the end. All the characters are very unique and distinct. There is one character that's pretty controversial because they make some very questionable decisions. So if you like a bit of morally greyness, you're going to get an Illborn. Last but certainly not least, we have Empire of the Vampire. Now this book is also over 700 pages long, but what's really interesting about Empire of the Vampire is I would never have said it was over 700 pages long. I devoured this book when I read it. I absolutely flew through it because I loved it so much. And it does not feel like 700 pages. So that definitely speaks to the pacing. I wouldn't say it's a fast-paced book, but it's definitely not a slow-paced book either. I think it's very well-paced, and the story is really interesting, and the characters are great, and the humor is great. It's just a great book. This is very similar story to The Name of the Wind. We have the main character, Gabriel, telling his story to a vampire. So we have this future Gabriel looking back on his life, and he talks about a younger Gabriel of how he gets into becoming a vampire hunter, and also an older Gabriel trying to deal with the world now that it is being overrun by vampires. And because this is told from the future Gabriel's perspective, being interviewed by a vampire in a cell, it does raise the question, did the vampires win? How did he end up in the cell? And I can confirm, they don't sparkle. The majority of vampires in this story are more like zombie-like creatures. You just kind of imagine them as this horde of undead, just running and trying to kill everybody. But there are these families of vampires who kind of have their own clans, I guess. And they're much smarter and not just this mass horde. Gabriel is a terrific character. He's really funny and snarky. If you've read Nevernight by Kristoff as well, it does have that same Kristoff style to it as Nevernight does, but not nearly as metaphorical as Nevernight. Great character work, really funny, really cool world building. I like this idea of these vampire hordes destroying the country and these vampire hunters trying to stop them and seemingly failed. We'll find out. And that'll do it for today. These are some of the longest fantasy books I have ever read. I did do a book talking about long fantasy books that I plan on reading very soon. But let me know, what is the longest fantasy book you have ever read? And have you read any of these? Or are any on your TBR? Also, my book, Harbinger of Justice, coming out June 9th. If you like dark fantasy, start a new dark fantasy trilogy. It's got some shadow magic stuff, some blood magic stuff, ancient mysteries, ruined cities, lost histories, and it's really pretty. Art by Felix Ortiz. And if you get a hardback, the naked hardback is the art without typography. So you look even closer at the beautiful art. So worst case scenario, you get a beautiful book on your shelf. I will have a video up when the pre-orders are live. Just waiting on the paperback proof, and then the pre-order should hopefully be live after that. I keep on forgetting to mention it at the end of my videos, but I am from now on. Look, I have a copy now. It's coming June 9th. But yes, thank you very much for watching. Outro.